Good evening everyone, and thank you for opening episode 12 of my series of talks about the history of English detective fiction from 1920 to about 1960. Tonight I want to discuss what I think is an important context for murder stories written for readers in England during the Golden Age, and that is the nature and organisation of the police forces at the time. Now, I want to stress I am not saying that police organisation influenced detective writing before the last war. I am saying that it suited the style and content of the stories very well, and so you might say eased the success of the genre. If things had been different, then probably either our favourite books would not have been written, or they might not have been so popular. So I think that the factors I'm going to set out are important. To give some drift to the subject, I want to use two examples which I'll speak about now and then come back to later in the podcast. In The Crime at Guildford, written in 1935, Freeman Wills-Croft introduced a chief inspector, but added a footnote explaining that the borough police force of Guildford had no chief inspectors at the time. He had introduced the character to avoid confusion with any real person. The concept of a county not having a chief inspector, at least one, seems odd to us today. Again, in The Body in the Library, Agatha Christie's 1942 novel, the first policeman on the scene is the village constable. He's followed by an inspector and his sergeant, but the next copper on the beat is the chief constable himself. Now, Christie was doing this as a plot device. She wanted to show that Colonel and Dolly Bantry were hobnobbing with the county set, but the immediate appearance of a chief constable would not have seemed so outlandish to the reading public of the time. First, some brief demographics. During the period of the Golden Age, the density of the population in England and Wales was about 70% of what it is today. So, less legs and less houses per acre. Furthermore, the proportion of children in the population was higher, so you saw less folk, and less of those folk were grown-ups. Now, I don't want to overemphasize this, but it does have a bearing when we consider the policemen who served these communities, which were effectively between 30 and 40% smaller than we might recognise. Nowadays, at a time when there are about 45 police forces in England and Wales, it does depend on how you count them, the pre-war world of countless police forces seems archaic. Let's look at my own county, Hampshire. I no longer live there. I live in Market Harbour in Leicestershire, but I grew up in Hampshire, so I still think of it as home. The territory covered by the single Hampshire and Isle of Wight Constabulary was served by 5 police forces before the war and 3 special constabularies. During their history, it was sometimes served by 6, depending on where Bournemouth was or wasn't. The Isle of Wight police was a separate force, but a generation earlier, this quiet country isle not only had the island police, but had borough forces serving the market town of Newport and the sleepy holiday resort of Ryde. Much of this diversity, by the way, had to do with how rates were raised at the time. In 1937, the county force for Hampshire had a chief constable. Now forget about deputy chief constables, assistant chief constables. Clearly there would have been no commanders, but there weren't even chief superintendents. Working directly to the one chief constable were 10 superintendents, and directly to them, no chief inspectors at all, but 16 inspectors, an odd proportion actually. There were about 40 sergeants supervising about 400 constables. There was, by the way, one police sergeant major. You'll look for him in vain nowadays, but he was in charge of drill and training. Very simply, and probably too simply, we can get our heads around this by thinking of one chief officer rank, supported by area superintendents, town and parish inspectors, with local sergeants and constables on the ground. Now, Add into that mix two other factors. In most city and borough police forces, the chief constable would have been the career equivalent of a superintendent. Many of the provincial forces had no CID at the time, although full-time detectives would have been included in the complements I've mentioned. Now let us return to our examples. If the borough police force had a chief constable equivalent to a superintendent, it is no longer surprising that he had no chief inspector to supervise his inspectors. If he's a super, he can do it himself, the watch committee would have said, and the watch committee were the people with the money. And back to the Bantries with their body in the library. If the first policeman on the scene was a constable, followed by a sergeant and inspector, it is not so irregular that the chief constable would turn up next. After all, he had no ACC crime to send. The point I am making is that here we have two examples where the police organisation fitted very neatly with different plot devices that Freeman's Willcroft and Agatha Christie wanted to employ. So what about the more detailed effects of these arrangements? Scotland Yard were the experts. There was very little CID expertise in the non-metropolitan provinces. If Scotland Yard were the experts, perhaps it is not so outlandish for detective writers to dress up the local police as rather slow. Yes, a plot device, but it suits the context. If the local police were low in numbers and probably not the expert, this leaves room for the amateur. Yes, it certainly does, but it also means any visiting Scotland Yarders, Inspector French for example, can be realistically seen liaising with the local sleuths. There were, after all, no investigation teams for them to take breakfast with at the local pub. Again, I'm not saying that this is factually accurate, or that it drove the plots of detective fiction. I am saying that when authors of the day wanted to take a few liberties with the truth, these factors provided a background that allowed them to get away with it. With so few grades around, inspectors, of course, could be seen making decisions that would seem well beyond their pay grade to our modern eyes, or at least, if they needed higher authority, they didn't have to trudge through many levels to get it. I can sense policemen up and down the land wishing for those golden days that have gone by. Then there is the assumption of local knowledge. If the authors of modern crime novels, poor things, want their professionals to learn if there is any local intelligence about an issue, they cannot realistically rely on simply asking a local sergeant or inspector. But for the detective writer of the Golden Age, that was entirely realistic. If the inspector and sergeants didn't know, the police didn't know. There was no one else. Again, the nature of policing eased the progress for the detective novelist. So where does this all fit into our history? It means that the elements of the detective story of the Golden Age, which seem unrealistic to us, were certainly more credible, if not realistic, to the pre-war reading public. It was essentially a world that they would have recognised, and because they recognised it, they tolerated the author's use of licence. The arrangements for policing, particularly in the provinces, gave room for many of the plot devices that detective writers delighted in. If things had been different, they wouldn't have been able to deliver the stereotypes of character, situation and dialogue that the true detective fan enjoys. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to episode 12 in my series of talks on the history of English detective fiction. My name is Malcolm Noble. My website is malcolmnoble.com. I hope you'll take a look at it. The podcast page on that website includes a list of previous episodes with links if you wish to catch up. I need to thank Freeze Effects for the royalty-free music. I posted this podcast on the 28th of March, 2 days late, and I'm sorry for that. but I will upload the next one on the 14th of April. I hope that you'll be there to listen. In the meantime, all that remains is for me to wish you good night and God bless.